Hello everyone, this is Jack with Let's Draw Today. Thank you so much for joining me and drawing with me today. In today's tutorial, we are going to learn an easy way to draw a realistic pumpkin. You can visit the link in the description for the step-by-step pictures that accompany this tutorial. With that said, let's get started. The first step in drawing a pumpkin is drawing its basic shapes. I began by sketching a shape for the right side with an HB pencil. Then I drew the outline of the left side a bit larger than the right. After that, I drew the outline of the stem. The next step is to begin drawing the many ribs of the pumpkin. Draw the first rib line by tracing the guideline from the previous step. It should be directly under the stem. Don't make it perfectly straight. Instead, draw it with a slight bend. To draw the first section, draw a curved line bulging upward from the first rib. Bring this line down and run a second rib almost parallel to it and following the same curvature of the first rib. Then connect the two ribs at the bottom. Now let's draw another rib. This section can be just about as wide as the first one. As we draw the ribs of the pumpkin, we'll need to pay attention to the curvature of the pumpkin's outer edge, as well as the curvature of the previous rib we drew. Now that we're getting the hang of it, we're going to draw 3 more ribs. It's okay to vary the positioning of each end of a rib. There's a deep tip at the top of this pumpkin where the base of the stem sits. All of the ribs take a downward dip just before reaching the stem. Draw the top of another rib or two, taking this dip on the other side of the pumpkin. On the right side of the pumpkin, we're going to repeat the same process that we did on the left by drawing 5 more ribs. Another thing about pumpkin ribs is that some of them are deep and some are shallow. Just like we did earlier at the dip near the stem, let's draw a couple more ribs on the other side. Draw lines coming from the base of the stem and curving up and over the dip. This completes the outline of our pumpkin shell. We'll do some work to the stem next. Now focusing on the stem itself, begin by erasing any guidelines from the beginning of the drawing. Then we'll just sharpen up the outline of the stem. We can also begin to establish some of the shape at the end of the stem. If you would like an easier and more accurate way to complete the line drawing of the pumpkin than the freehand method I'm using, you can try the transfer method, grid method, or a plot point method for additional support. I have ready-made outlines, grids, and plot point downloads for this tutorial and others available for members of the Let's Draw Today Club. Next, begin to draw lines on the stem of the pumpkin. Draw lines close together that follow the curvature of the stem. There's this little depression at the tip of the stem, so we need to draw some bumpy lines to indicate that. Use an HB and 4B pencil to shade the stem. The strongest light source is coming from the upper left. Therefore, we should leave more highlights along the left side and place darker shadow tones on the right and underside. Add some darker shading to the hole at the tip of the stem. Now we're going to make the outer edge of the stem look a little bumpier to match the texture of the surface. Use a kneaded eraser to erase the outline of the edge. Then lightly redraw this line with a few bumps. Next, let's start to shade the skin of the pumpkin. Remember that the strongest light source is coming from the upper left. Lightly sketch the outline of some highlights on the upper part of the left side of the pumpkin. Then sketch the outline of shadows along the ribs. With an HB pencil, lightly shade some midtone values in this first section of the pumpkin skin. Shade around the white area in the upper left that was identified as a highlight. Use a 4B pencil to shade along the rib. Using the guidelines for value changes will help to make sure you don't put too much shadow in the mid-tone or highlighted areas. Use an HB pencil to shade the second section. Leave a thin strip of reflected light along the edge of the rib to make it look like there is an actual dip in the surface of the shell along the rib. Sticking with the same section, use a 4B pencil to shade along the rib. Make sharper marks with your pencil along portions of the rib and gradually lessen the pressure as you blend into the midtones. Use a 4B pencil to put some shadow tones near the bottom of the first two sections. Since the pumpkin has a round shape, shading it is similar to how we would shade a sphere. Leave a thin strip of reflected light between the dark tones and the edge of the rib. Now we can move on to the next section. There are some minor impressions in the skin surface near the top here. I'm going to use an HB to put a few tones near the highlight here before shading any more of this section. There are also a couple more impressions running down the length of this section between these two ribs. Sketch these impressions centered between the ribs, but don't sketch a solid line all the way down like we have with the other ribs. Keep using the HB pencil to lightly shade the section. Just as we did with the other two sections, make your pencil strokes follow the direction and curvature of the pumpkin shell. Use the 4B pencil to outline the rib. Blend the graphite into the lighter tones as you shade away from the rib. Shade the bottom of the section at the base of the pumpkin. Leave some reflected light along the left edge. Further develop the depth of this deep rib by using the 4B pencil to shade along the rib, immediately to the left of it. Then use the HB pencil to bridge a gradual transition from the dark shadow of the rib to the lighter mid-tone values of the pumpkin's shell. Use an HB to start lightly shading a base layer for the fourth section. Shade a slightly darker layer of tones over the base layer. Go back to the 4B to overlay even darker tones. Repeat these steps again for the fifth section. We can now go ahead and finish up this section at the top. I'll just use an HB to add a little bit of shading, including some along the border and some slightly darker shading at the base near the stem. That leaves us with this little band of highlight. Now we'll keep shading the next two sections of the pumpkin shell. Use the HB to shade a base layer of light tones. Add a second layer of darker tones. Use a 4B to go over darker areas of the section. Then use your HB and 4B to shade the next section. This side of the pumpkin is on the opposite side of the direct sunlight, so it will have a little more shadow than the left side. Add a bit more detail to the stem. Use the 4B to enhance the texture and appearance of the stem by adding more shadow near the base. Add a few more shadows to the ridges on the upper portion of the stem. Okay, pick up the HB pencil again for the next section. Before adding the first layer of shading, go down the middle of the section to lightly shade an impression down the middle. Then shade the rest of the section. Start outlining the rib to the left with a 4B. Then put shading at the bottom of the section. Keep remembering to preserve some reflected light along the edges, even in all of the shadow areas. With your HB, start tracing over the next rib and the final sections of the pumpkin. Make the next rib a bit darker and keep the rib to the right of it lighter. Start putting some light tones near the top. Lightly shade down the right side of the pumpkin, then add some darker tones. Switch back and forth between the HB and 4B as you add layers of shading and additional details. Look at your overall drawing so far and make sure that the lighter areas are at the upper left with a few highlights at the upper right side. Make sure the base of the pumpkin has the most shading. Use an HB pencil to lightly shade the final sections at the top of the pumpkin. Use the 4B to go over the ribs. Like we did with the top on the other side of the stem. There isn't too much detail needed here since there isn't too much we can see. Use the 4B pencil to draw spots on the pumpkin's skin. Outline the bottom edge of the pumpkin with the 4B pencil. This is where we draw a cast shadow. Start shading under the pumpkin with a sideways motion. Next, create a crosshatch pattern by repeating this with another layer. Directly under the pumpkin, put another layer of shading. This cast shadow where the pumpkin meets the table should be where you place your darkest tones. To draw the stump, begin by sketching a curved line on the left side. Then draw a line for the right side of the pumpkin. Curve this line downward. Allow enough room for your shadow to be on the top of the stump. Bring some of the pumpkin shadow out a little more toward the edges of the stump. As for the sides of the stump, there's not a whole lot we can see. Just shade the small part that is visible. Then shade the slanted bridge between the vertical side and the flat top. Begin drawing cracks in the surface of the woody stump. Use a series of lines that are mostly straight, but still wiggly and imperfect. Have the cracks branch apart in some places. Draw some cracks with light dotted lines and thicker cracks with heavier lines. Keep drawing lines that radiate generally toward the center of the stump under the pumpkin. Start sketching circular rings around the top surface of the stump. Draw them in a way similar to how you drew the straight cracks. Use a loose touch with your pencil and follow the general curvature of the stump's edges. To finish up, sketch a few more straight lines pointing toward the center. Loosely and lightly sketch a few more circular rings as well. Put a little more shading on each side of the stump. Make final adjustments in value and finishing touches. Erase any stray marks. And that is an easy way to draw a realistic pumpkin. If you would like to see the complete version of this tutorial with step-by-step video clips at normal speed, or if you would like 10 of my real-time tutorials for free, click on the link in the description for more info. If you found this video to be helpful, please like it, leave a comment, share, and subscribe to my channel. Be sure to click on the notification bell so you don't miss new videos. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for drawing with me today.